Sup guys, it's time for another tier list review, this time for the Chinese Wiki tier list. But before we begin, I gotta talk some bullshit as usual, completely unrelated to the tier list by the way. Yesterday, I came across this rather flattering paragraph about me underneath a post in which someone linked my ECTL video, and I would like to share this moment with you all. Jimmy is an absolute awful source on AL meta Lamau. He's even worse than Qyet. This dude tiered Ranger above Enterprise and Hakuryu because there is a 1 in roughly 7,000 chance she will outdamage them by a small amount if her two extremely RNG skills trigger 5 times in a row at the same time, and has Haku below Enterprise even though Haku wins more often than not unless NT gets lucky E for every airstrike in the battle. Hopefully my reading of his comment did justice to the original poster. A truly verbose, masterfully crafted passage from a real intellectual. You can see his passion for the game woven into the very words. The only thing that I can really pick at though is that Ranger triggering both skills 5 times in a row is actually a 1 in a 13 million chance, as you can see here. So his estimation of 1 in roughly 7,000 is about 5 orders of magnitudes off. Math is certainly not his strong point, but I'm sure his talents lie elsewhere. From the way all irony seems to bounce off his skull, I think that what we're dealing with here is either a 14-year-old or a Redditor. I will let you decide which one it is. Another reply says, "Glad to see those points again, but not any testing of any capacity done to prove the point." This is a little ambiguous, but I believe this commenter is referring to me. Since I am known for making claims without evidence, rather than addressing the point directly, I will just deflect with this quick little screenshot, which Rises gave me permission to use. There is no additional context needed, and the implication is exactly as it says. Now, I don't want people to get the wrong idea. I don't have anything personal against the English community tier list, but I occasionally will feel the urge to retaliate when my name gets dragged. One last commenter wrote another huge paragraph. I'm not going to read the entire thing, but it seems like he's lost as to whether he is supposed to be talking about a 10-minute video or a 30-minute video. So chances are, he has never watched any of my videos, yet he felt the need to police what a guide maker can or cannot put in their guides. I feel truly ashamed that my videos are not up to the standards of somebody who doesn't watch them. Inside this thread, I was pleasantly surprised that there were people respectfully defending me without using any ad hominem attacks, so it seems like I have been attracting mostly the right crowd, and I really appreciate it. However, it seems like there are some viewers who are not too happy with my sense of humor, as you can see here. So, as a favor to this commenter, I'm turning it into a beginner guide only channel. If you consider yourself to be a veteran player watching this, just for some laughs, feel free to leave now. And now, let's finally get on to today's topic. This is the July 2nd version, so no PR6s yet. The Chinese Wiki tier list is actually separated into 2 different tier lists. The first specifically for Chapter 14, and second specifically for Operation Siren. Rather than absolute strength, it is trying to convey which ships are the highest priority to be raised and awakened. Aside from these tier lists, there are also many other resources on the same page, including equipment and augment guides. But I will only be reviewing the 2 major tier lists. All of it is in Chinese of course, and not only that, but the terminology used is not that of everyday conversation. So if you're not fluent in Chinese, you're probably better off using English resources for pretty much everything. I have translated whatever is necessary though, to try my best to understand their tiering decisions. Apart from the language barrier, there is also not a lot of crossover between the Chinese and English communities, so a lot of things that we take for granted as a fact might be different from their perspective, and vice versa of course. And to be honest, looking at the difference in the EXP curves as well as the upgrade costs, let's be honest, they're playing on easy mode. Anyways, I'm gonna begin with the Chapter 14 tier list. If I get through this in a reasonable amount of time, then I'll do the Operation Siren one in the same video. Otherwise, the Operation Siren one will get its own video. The criteria, which is listed right here, is as follows. The strength of the ship at level 125, 200 affection, and the ease of use. Whether or not there is a better alternative for the same role. Solo performance is valued over specific team compositions. This part is similar to the English community tier list. However, unlike the ECTL, they're grading the ships cross-hull, which I think makes more sense because light cruisers, for example, aren't only fighting for spots against other light cruisers, but with destroyers and heavy cruisers as well. They also have separate categories, being support, torpedo burst, healers, faction buffers, anti-air, and submarines. Other than that, they assume that the ships are fully completed. Also, they recommend that you uncap your main fleet first, then your tank, and finally your support ships. One last thing, I believe that in the same tier, ships on the left are rated slightly higher than the ships on the right. Okay, let's get started with the destroyers. First up, for Yudachi, it says high output off tank. In my opinion, I think Yudachi can main tank comfortably in Chapter 14, but there are definitely better choices. Next, I completely disagree with this placement of Shimakaze. On auto, there's no ship like Shimakaze in Chapter 14. What sets her apart from other incredible damage dealers like Plymouth is that 100% of her damage is unaimed, and almost all of it ignores shields. Her damage doesn't come out in a consistent stream like Plymouth, but her torps can actually one-shot a lot of enemies, like a main fleet ship, which no other Vanguard ship can replicate. Here is a loadout that I've been experimenting with. Conventionally, these torpedoes are not a good option for anything other than manual face torping. But in Chapter 14, there are so many enemies that it ends up having pretty good hit rate. While magnetic torpedoes will have multiple torps home into the same enemy, the Quint 610s fly straight, and each torp will likely hit a different enemy. But it's so strong that it pretty much instantly deletes anything that it touches, giving it almost the same effect as an airstrike. I'm not 100% certain yet that it is better than using a more conventional option, but give it a try if you're skeptical. I think you would be surprised. Obviously, this is only if you have like 2,000 torpedo plates lying around to upgrade these to plus 13. Her ability to actually take out enemies by herself is especially valuable in boss fights, where she can take out one or two of the triple BB spawns by herself. And this is not to mention that her cross-fleet buff actually makes a bigger difference than Kronstadt's by quite a large margin, since lower main gun spread is not necessarily desirable in Chapter 14, while a lot of torpedo destroyers are very good. At worst, I would move Shimakaze up to SS tier for auto. Take note of this little green note, which says either better on manual or relies on manual. If you were playing manual, I would probably rate her even above Plymouth, putting her at the imaginary triple S rank up here. Next up are Jervis and Janus. Since they are considered as a pair, in my opinion, they would be better than Yudachi plus any other destroyer that isn't Shimakaze, but in the context of having to uncap two separate ships, I can see why they're here. Next is another disagreement. You guys know I'm a huge fan of Anshan, but in Chapter 14, all of her strengths fall completely flat. Pretty much all of her damage is aimed, which is the opposite of Shimakaze, which I've shown is more unreliable than usual in Chapter 14, due to the concealment mechanic. Not to mention all the shields that the enemies have. There are a lot of medium and heavy armor enemies as well, and Anshan's preferred target by far is light armor. Against only light armor, her damage exceeds even that of Plymouth's. But all of the previously mentioned factors combined make her not a great option in Chapter 14, so in that context alone, she is quite overrated here. Her notes say that she can be sortied solo and is relatively bulky, and by relative, I think they are comparing her to Changshen, but in the grand scheme of things, she's not exactly a tank. Next up is Otto, and the note says the bulkiest destroyer, which I don't think is unanimous when compared to Jervis. And not only that, but she will be dethroned as soon as Felix is added. They do have her a little bit further down than Janus and Jervis though, so it is acceptable. After that is something very interesting. Charles Osborne. Just like Usagi's tier list, Charles Osborne is much higher than I would expect, with ECTL's rating closer to what I think her performance would be on paper. The notes say well-rounded and tank support, which, from reading her skills, imply that she would be sortied with another destroyer tank using a beaver badge. Let's say that you sortie her with Otto. Would that really be better than sorting auto with Z1? I'm not so sure. However, since I haven't used her, I can't really form an opinion. Personally, I find that the most useful part about tier lists is when I see a ship that is rated much higher than I would expect, which piques my curiosity, and then I investigate and hopefully find something interesting. Moving on, we have Changchun, whose note says relatively squishy, again relative to Anshan, mostly because she doesn't have the 10% evasion stat buff that Anshan has. The difference is not great, but since they're considered separately, Anshan is technically a direct replacement over her, which is something they consider, so she's one tier lower. Although I think she should be in the same tier, just one spot to the right. And both of them should probably be in low A to high B+. After that, we have Kawakaze, who I would have no trouble putting in low S or high A+. While Rigolo, who I initially thought would be slightly better than Wakatsuki, is actually not better than Wakatsuki, especially not in Chapter 14 where anti-submarine warfare is relevant. So I would probably switch Rigolo with Kitakaze and Wakatsuki. But this version of the tier list is quite close to when Rigolo first came out, so I give them a pass for this placement. Not for Kawakaze though. As we go further down the list, there are a lot of ships that I have not thoroughly used, so I won't comment any further. Now let's take a look at the light cruisers. First, let me translate this note, which is talking about how ships with very high AA, such as Cheshire, Isuzu, Ingraham, and so on would increase in tiers for Chapter 13. So it's pretty intuitive and not super important. Plymouth in SS tier is a no-brainer. They could honestly put a gap between Plymouth and the second tier of light cruisers. For Harbin, aside from high damage, they also wrote a note about having really good smokescreen, which I can obviously agree with. A consistent smokescreen helps to counter flares dropped on your Vanguard. I don't know much about this collab ship, so I won't comment. After that, I will immediately point out that Scylla is extremely underrated. Her notes say anti-air and carrier support, but her biggest strengths in Chapter 14 are her insane unaimed barrages, as well as the fact that she requires minimum equipment to fully function. Personally, I would move her up to S tier with Harbin. In the S tier, we see Kuibyshev and Helena Meta for gun-focused light cruisers. Although I don't know if the likes of Montpellier with her augment and Seattle deserve to be so much underneath Helena Meta in Chapter 14. I do think it's reasonable to put Kuibyshev above Mainz and Emden though, as I find her damage to be a little bit higher, and it's cute that they made a little spot here for Mainz, putting a little bit of personality in the tier list, which I can't fault them for. After that, it says high torpedo damage light cruisers. I have no clue how Belfast made it in here, maybe because of her smoke, which is not reliable at all, but Belfast above Nashiro? Nah man, come on. Voroshilov's note just says firepower / gun version of Nashiro. How could the gun version of Nashiro be above Nashiro in a chapter where guns are relatively worse than torpedoes? Anyways, that's pretty much all I have to say about the light cruiser tier. Next, we move on to the heavy and large cruisers. This might be controversial to say, but I think Aegir is overrated here for a few reasons. In most cases, she brings over other large cruisers, being the tankiest of them all, having a really good and mostly reliable slow, and armor break. However, she is not the tankiest by a huge margin, the slow is not really useful in Chapter 14, and the way armor break is applied is definitely much more suited to single enemy fights. On the other hand, Brest, for example, is barely squishier than Aegir, offers heals and a bit more damage in exchange for the slow that doesn't matter much, and a super unreliable armor break. The note for Aegir says that she is the best boss tank, and that Brest is the best mob tank, but I think I would prefer Brest in both situations, and would put Brest as the best large cruiser for Chapter 14 only. But as this is technically an investment tier list, I can totally see why they would try to push Aegir, who would be much better in every other scenario. They're basically trading some technical correctness to be a little bit more helpful for a newbie player. Anchorage is of course deserving of her spot for having a reliable smokescreen to protect your other vanguards. After that, we have the other two large cruisers who are about the same in Chapter 14, with Kronstadt on the left because she is pretty much strictly better than Azuma. Next, I would honestly leave this tier empty because investment is taken into account with this tier list, and I don't think that Drake even deserves A+, if that is taken into account. With Cheshire, there's already a note which says that she should be in S tier in chapter 13, and outside of AA Hells, I don't think she is a definitive upgrade over ships in A tier, so I will just move both these ships down and leave A+ empty, kinda like in the column next to this one. After that, the A and B+ ships perform quite similarly, but I'm glad that they at least also agree that Haguro's damage reduction puts her value noticeably above Portland's. Portland herself is no slouch though, as you can see there are some pretty decent ships in her tier. Overall, I think there is little difference between the A and B+ tiers for heavy cruisers anyway, so I won't bother nitpicking too much. And after that, we move on to the buff category. I definitely agree with Kazagumo's placement, as her buff scales extremely well out of ammo, and there are plenty of good 2-carrier fleet archetypes, such as Shinano, Healer and Odin, or Musashi, Healer and Aquila. Air Raid Assist really helps Unicorn's airstrike clear out an entire wave reliably, especially so when out of ammo. And the heal is also extremely valuable as well. Gloucester is listed here for out of ammo situations only. Her buff gives the entire fleet 30% more damage when out of ammo, so I can definitely see their rationale, but I haven't experimented with her yet, so I can't comment much. After that is Haman 2, who they say is generally going to be a downgrade from Kazagumo, but could be better if using Musashi. John increases survivability by a lot, and was a staple in many of my initial clears. Next is Helena, after a big gap, which I completely agree with. You can see that even on the first or second day, I already noticed that desyncing your main fleet would yield better results in boss fights than using Helena, so she's much less valuable than in certain other fights. The rest of the ships in the buff category I have not used much in chapter 14 specifically, so I cannot comment much on their effectiveness. After that, we move on to the healers. This is the first tier list I've reviewed which acknowledges that Unicorn is better than Perseus, probably because they do consider direct replacements, in which case it is clear as day that Unicorn is better. Props for that, as it is definitely something that will be helpful for players lacking greater context. Claudia I haven't really used, so I can't really comment, but I suppose she trades a little bit of healing power for damage when compared to Unicorn. The secondary healers which they listed here are two that I have featured time and time again in my auto-search fleets. Aquila Fighter Mode makes for an invincible combo with Musashi, while Volga generally brings more healing and damage otherwise, but her heal does have a little RNG. As mentioned, Perseus is under Unicorn, and I think when specifically referring to chapter 14, Ryuho would be on the same level, and I personally even prefer Ryuho because I like to use destroyers in chapter 14. And after that, we can see that Shinano is the highest out of all of the damage carriers, which makes total sense as she deals top tier damage with unmatched support, especially for IJN carriers, which is abundant in the higher tiers. Yorktown 2 is in second place, with a note that says Air Superiority and Chapter 13, so I honestly don't know why they even put her here. For Haku, it says she's good sortied alone, which I assume means without Shinano, and provides boss support. Personally, I would put her down a tier because she's definitely not the best solo ship. Who I would move up here instead is probably Independence, who has a note saying S tier in chapters 12 and 13, but in general I think she's just straight up better in all campaign stages than Yorktown 2. Taiho could probably go up slightly, because I don't think her damage is lower than many of the S and A+ rank damage dealers, but she is a lot more bulky. The rest of the list looks pretty reasonable, and by that I mean I can't be bothered to nitpick the lower tiers. But I don't know why they even included the repair ships for chapter 14. After that, let's take a look at the battleships. Vanguard is in first place with a note which says the best main fleet damage support, but personally I think AoE damage is just more valuable. At most, I would shift her a few spots down within the same tier though, so it's not super important. Bismarck, Zwei, and Musashi are tied for triple S, which is where I would also put Manuel Shimakaze. Zwei has a note that says strong in out of ammo fights, referring to the unfulfilled promise, but I haven't actually used her in Chapter 14 yet. Musashi, however, I have a lot of experience with and definitely deserves this high rating, because she protects your backline from ramming of submarines that happen to leak through. So with her, you can skip putting an anti-submarine plane on Unicorn, as the subs will just do nothing when they hit your main fleet. FDG is equally as good in terms of damage output and clear time, but just lacks the main fleet protection, putting her ever so slightly under Musashi, and you would have to use an anti-submarine plane on your healer if you choose to go with FDG. Also, the note here says, better than Tamaki. Wow, thanks! Speaking of Tamaki, I think the reason she's higher than New Jersey here is because of her special auxiliary guns. Instead of the note saying equally as good for mobs and boss though, which can actually apply to all of the ships in front of her, it should probably just point out that her skills buff her aux guns, which can help with interception. As for Patricia, I can't really comment on. New Jersey is in a tier lower than the rest because she's a single target specialist, which unfortunately just isn't the best in Chapter 14. And she doesn't have anything to make up for it like Tamaki. I should add that the blue background refers to boss-only ratings, so the equivalent of a boss tag for ECTL, meaning that New Jersey would be even lower than this if you used her in the mobs, whereas the yellow background refers to boss ratings, so the same as a boss tag on ECTL, so Patty and Gascon should not be used against bosses. After that, they have UVH, who I think is underrated, but I would only consider her for the boss fleet. Her cross-fleet barrage helps significantly in interception for the mob fleet, and her high damage uptime allows her to deal with pesky minor spawns in the boss fleet. Also, since she has extremely low cooldowns, she becomes revealed very easily, and you can take advantage of knowing that will happen to protect your other main fleet ships. One last thing I will point out is that I believe Hood and Seydlitz are definitely underrated. For a player who doesn't have all of the UR ships to DPS raise the boss, Seydlitz decreases the chance of your main fleet dying to almost zero. Hood is slightly weaker than the ships in the tier above her, but much more consistent, and you can make up for her weakness with other ships in your fleet. Her reload buff also makes a bigger difference than people give it credit for. And next we have subs. They rate Wolfpack the highest because of damage, but in Chapter 14, I think that oxygen capacity is actually more helpful because they would have more staying power if you use them for multiple battles. Personally, I think the best would be 2 fishes with Da Vinci. Something I do want to point out though are the notes that they have for Royal Fortune. It says that she is not compatible with Chapter 14 because she is a light armor specialist who is very weak against heavy armor and does not do well against concealed enemies with her aimed damage. This is a very reasonable take from people who have actually played Chapter 14 thoroughly, but ironically, the exact same criticisms can be levied against a ship like Anshan, as well as some other gun destroyers like Changchun, Tashkent, and Suzuki, but it seems like it only matters with Royal Fortune, who is basically a gun destroyer herself. The last tidbits are just some tips for new players, so I won't be going over them. Overall, I like that they decided to rate things specifically around Chapter 14, making it a lot more straightforward than the guidelines that ECTL chose, but I found some of their tiering decisions to be a little strange. They also try to provide context with the notes, but not as much as the full descriptions that ECTL has, and sometimes they're not super helpful, like with FTG. The tips that they drop here and there though could be helpful to new players provided you can actually read the language. Overall, assuming that it is able to be read fluently and with the appropriate context, I give it a 7 out of 10 for having a specific, well-defined criteria, and little decisions like putting Drake and Perseus a little bit lower to decrease the chances of new players investing a lot of resources into them when better alternatives exist. Some criticisms, other than just disagreements with tiering, which I'm obviously going to have with every tier list, even including mine depending on the day, is that the presentation could be a little bit nicer, but ECTL set a pretty high standard for that. And also, some of the notes could be a little bit more helpful, and probably consistent in the case of something like Anshan compared to Royal Fortune. I would not recommend this if you can't read it, and if you can, then the best approach is to Actually try out the recommendations they give, and then compare it to the recommendations given by ECTL, and see which one you like better. If you combine only the good parts of both of these tier lists, then it will almost be half as good as mine. And that's pretty much it for the Chinese Wiki Chapter 14 tier list review. I'm gonna have to make a part 2 because even this part became very long. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.